Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Bartuska with the Florida Aviation Network, and we're here at Plane Time in Orlando, Florida. Today, we're going to talk about a different topic than we've talked about in the past. We're going to combine meteorology with an actual season and an actual application. We're going to talk about winter weather first, and if we get a chance, we're going to look into icing. Icing is very complex and very difficult phenomenon to forecast. But let's start off with a couple PowerPoints, a couple slides. When we talk about winter flying and winter operations, everything is relevant. This slide is for 1986 when the Space Shuttle Challenger unfortunately exploded. The temperature on the launch pad in Titusville, Florida on that morning was 29 degrees, not a normal operating situation. Another in reflection accident that happened in icing conditions was the Air Florida crash in Washington, D.C. Excuse me just a sec. In the end, it was considered a failure to use the engine anti-ice system and to make sure the aircraft was fully de-iced. And a situation with a MD-81 in Scandinavian Airlines where the wings had ice on it and the flight crew didn't know it, and the ice actually got ingested by the engines. Both engines flamed out. Luckily, no one was killed. The aircraft broke up into a couple different pieces. And finally, what is probably the most interesting one from the standpoint of a general aviation pilot is a talk that John and Martha King give every year when they're at Sun and Fun about their organization, King Aviation, of how they really learned about being pilots and co-pilots in winter operation. They almost lost their life. They were flying a Cessna 210 in the winter to Sioux Falls. They had a generator failure, and they didn't stop to get it looked at. They thought, you know, we can keep going. After flying almost 4 hours with a dead battery, no radios, getting dark, they had to let down from 11,500 feet and try and find the ground. They were scared to death they were going to hit an antenna or a tree or a utility pole. Luckily, when they broke through the clouds, it was just getting to be dusk. They saw the lights of cars and telephone poles and wires, and they were able, John was able to put the plane down in a field. Unfortunately, that field was frozen ice on top of snow, and when the aircraft sank through the ice, they stopped like hitting a brick wall. And all the cargo and tools they had behind them stored in the aircraft went over their heads and out the windshield. And unfortunately, Mrs. King was slightly injured, but they almost lost their lives, but they gained an appreciation for aviation and winter flying they never had before. So let me put one more scene on. We're going to talk about winter flying before I get into the meteorology. You can come back to me now. I want to go over a couple things that we don't miss in this talk no matter what. Number one, what's the difference between flying cross country in the winter versus flying cross country any other time of the year? If something happens and you lose an engine or you have to put that plane down, it might be 20 degrees out Fahrenheit. It might be 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. If it's during the summer and you have to put the plane down, no problem. But if it's during the winter, you've got to be in the true survival mode. So even if you're flying VFR, file a flight plan so people know where you are. I'm also a member of the Civil Air Patrol. When the Civil Air Patrol goes to look for an airplane, it really helps if they have some idea what direction you were going and where you were going at the speed that they're going to find you. In addition, have an ELT, have some kind of locating beacon device on that aircraft. I think you can get one on Amazon for $85. Once again, if there's a flight plan and a signal, people are going to find you. And you should have a survival kit with some warm clothes. And certainly do extensive pre-flight planning in the winter. Get a good weather briefing, do an extra comprehensive walk around on your aircraft, fuel check, and engine warm up and run up, so you can see if anything is wrong with that aircraft. If you run into trouble, the main things that happen in the winter, it's cold, there's ice, there's snow, and a lot of times there's wind. If there's a blizzard in progress, there'll be a lot of wind, and but sometimes there isn't any, it just depends. And we're going to talk about runway conditions and taxi conditions. Proactive steps. First thing I want to talk about are the wheels on the aircraft. Here's a model of a Cessna aircraft. And notice this one, since the 1930s, we've been putting these fairings on wheels to streamline the tires. Well, if you take off on a runway that's got a lot of slush from de-icing the runway or whatnot, that water, that slush, that snow and ice is going to get up in that fairing, and while you're flying, it may freeze. And when you land that aircraft, those wheels aren't going to want to turn. So you're going to be sliding all over the place. Hopefully you don't have an accident. So take the fairings off if you're flying in the winter, so you don't have the possibility. If your aircraft has retractable gear, you may want to retract them and unretract them a couple times just to make sure you blow off whatever got stuck in the brakes on that aircraft. Your pitot tube. We've had many general aviation, corporate aviation, and airline accidents because we didn't put attention to detail on this pitot tube. It's not just for airspeed, it's the whole static system for all your instrumentation. This one doesn't happen to be heated, but that pitot tube heat is a lifesaver if you have it and you can turn it on. And when you're not flying the aircraft, you want to make sure you have it covered so water and ice can't get in there and build up that you don't even know is in there. Engine breather tube. In addition to all the other things on the aircraft, there's a little tube going to the valve cover on the engine that allows the back side of the piston pressure to be vented. If that gets froze up, you're going to have trouble with the engine and the lubrication system. Winter oil. Make sure that you're using the weight of oil that you should be using and operating in the winter. Not 30 or 40 or 50 weight that we might be using here in Florida because it gets up to 95 degrees, but some lower weight of oil as recommended by the Pilot Operating Handbook. Check your cabin heater. I'm going to talk later about carbon monoxide poisoning, but check your cabin heater, make sure it's working correctly, and the carburetor heat. Anytime the outside air temperature is between 10 degrees centigrade or 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the throat of the carburetor can experience icing, which we're going to talk about here a little bit later. Just for your information, I'm previously an aircraft mechanic in the Navy, and one of my responsibilities was anti-ice and de-ice system. But most general aircraft don't have that. They don't have a jet engine to take bleed air off to heat the leading edge of the wings or the empennage, and they don't have de-icer boots that you can expand with pneumatics and break ice off. So we've really got to put attention to detail to not getting into icing in the first place. The airlines are in business to make a profit. They're expected to fly in almost all weather. And what I have here, airline operations, operational decisions. Minimize the amount of time an aircraft spends on the ground after being de-ice and anti-ice. Well, you want to make sure that when you're taking off, the aircraft is clean. But you also want to make sure the aircraft is taking off, so you're generating revenue. In the case of private aircraft, however, you, the pilot, have complete responsibility for the go, no-go decision to fly based on your training and the best information available. And the decision for that day, the best decision may be not to fly. Keep that in your mind. There's nothing wrong with saying, you know what, this doesn't want to be the day I don't live from my flying fun. Situational and time pressures can affect your decision making. Check for fuel contamination. from condensation of water in the fuel tanks. Anytime we lower the temperature, if there's any water vapor in the fuel tanks, in the wings, or anywhere else you might have a fuel tank, it's going to condense out, and that water is going to end up in the fuel. And the only way you're going to know it's there is to check the tanks with your fuel checker. If the fuel does not drain freely when you go to check the sump, investigate the obstruction for sediment or ice. Have an A&P person come look at it and make sure there's not a problem there. Now, cold start problems. The first one can be icing over the spark plug electrodes. If you flew in and shut the aircraft down and it's sat there all night long and it's 0 degrees or minus 20 Fahrenheit, and you go to start that aircraft, if there was any water vapor in there, you might have freezing over the spark plug electrodes. So keep that in mind when you start. After you start, apply maximum carb heat to vaporize any water, anything that might be in there, and melt any kind of ice that might be in there. And this assists the fuel in vaporization and give the engine sufficient heat. Once you've had maximum carb heat on and you're comfortable that all the gauges are reading correctly and your instrumentation is good, you'll want to back off the carb heat, but not necessarily get rid of it. Let's talk about takeoff. One of the things that happens in cold weather, one of the reasons people love flying in Alaska, is because of the density altitude situation. You can be in a situation at takeoff where you're actually at 8,000 feet below sea level from density altitude. The engine's going to run better, you're going to get more lift on the wings, the propeller is going to be more efficient, but as you climb out and get into a little warmer atmospheric conditions, you're going to lose that advantage. So it's something to think about in the back of your head. Always check the wings again for snow and ice. Don't take off with any snow or ice on your wings. If you're flying a corporate jet, yes, the impact pressure from high speed generates heat and might melt that, but for small aircraft, we don't want any snow or ice on there. And by the way, at this point in the lecture, let me remind you that everything that I'm talking about is in the FARM, in the Federal Aviation Reg. There's a whole section on winter flying and icing, and there are even textbooks on icing and winter operations. I just happened to bring a couple of them with me. Back to carb heat. Use carb heat as required. Turn on the pitot heat if equipped. Warning, takeoff may not be possible in deep snow. In your pilot operating handbook, it talks about what if the runway has a certain amount of water on it? Are you going to be able to generate enough speed to get airborne with the engine you have? Well, if there's a foot or two of snow there, that may have the identical problem of you not being able to get enough airspeed to actually take off. En route, once we get airborne, look for winter weather changes. The weather is always changing. The weather is always changing. What you looked at online with the aviation weather section from the National Weather Service may have changed. Everything is moving. You might encounter a whiteout phenomena where all of a sudden you can't see anything. And if you're not an instrument-rated pilot, you're going to be in a real fix. But during your private pilot's license, you learn to use the instruments, so you'll use those as backup until you get out of the whiteout situation. Now let's talk real specifically about carburetor ice or carburetor induction ice. Most aircraft either have most general aviation aircraft have a reciprocating engine, so they're using either a carburetor or they're using fuel injection. But what these both have in common is they have to be intaking the air from outside at 10 or 20 degrees above freezing and going through here, and if there's any moisture in there and you're not using carb heat, you could get icing in the throat, you could get icing on the throttle plate, the thing that actually controls how fast the engine's going to go, in the injection unit, or in the actual carburetor. Down inside here is a venturi. And that venturi is what's pulling the fuel out of the float bowl of the carburetor, and it can get iced up. So you need to be using carb heat. I'll talk about the indicators for that in a sec. here's another thing I want to cover. When we think of icing on aircraft, we think of, okay, it's got to be below 0 degrees centigrade or 32 degrees Fahrenheit. It can actually be above that and freeze. How? Here's a wing section. When the air goes over the wing, it creates a low pressure center. One thing we don't emphasize too much in flight training is when that pressure goes down, the temperature goes down also. So we can get freezing here we can get freezing temperatures here on a day where the ambient air is not freezing. The exact same thing happens or can happen inside the carburetor. So to prevent carb ice situations, there's the ground heating we talked about at the beginning. There's the carburetor heat and the icing range of where icing is possible. And there's carb heat on approach and descent. What are the warning signs? The first warning sign is a loss of RPM of your engine. Why is your RPM going down? You haven't touched anything. It might be because you're somewhere in the induction system, you're picking up ice. So you should immediately put on the carb heat. Loss of RPM, a drop in the manifold pressure. The engine starts running rough. Well, if you got plenty of fuel, what's happening? It's probably icing. So apply carb heat immediately. Now I want to talk about carbon monoxide poisoning. We don't generally run the heater in the summer, no problem, but in the winter, when you're in that cockpit, it's going to be cold and you're going to have some source of heating that cockpit. Carbon monoxide indicators are as cheap as $5 from a card you can put in the cockpit to around $100 for a bona fide carbon monoxide detector. Carbon monoxide is colorless, it's odorless, and it's tasteless. But if you can smell fumes, you need to assume there's carbon monoxide present. If you feel sluggish, if you have a headache, if you're getting ringing in your ears, if you're nauseated, if you feel dizzy, if your vision is impaired, number one, turn off the cabin heating system. Number two, get some fresh air in there somehow. Open the window, do whatever you can, and land as soon as possible. Get oxygen if it's available. Now, we've talked about takeoff, we talked about en route. Now let's talk a little bit about letdown or descent out of en route. We're still monitoring for icing and snow the entire time on the wings. We're going to talk about that in a minute. You may need some more power than usual if you've picked up anything and you can't see it. If you tend to overspeed, lower the flaps to control your airspeed, use the carb heat. Monitor visibility for ice fog. Ice fog is found close to populated areas. It's a meteorological condition that combines with smog. When we hear smog, we think Los Angeles or a big city. But any industrial area or an area with a lot of cars is throwing a lot of soot in the air, and that soot serves as a condensation nuclei for clouds, and all fog is a cloud near the ground or a cloud where you don't want it. So just keep that in mind. Now landing. Check your runway conditions. If there's nobody at that runway or at that airport on Unicom or something else to tell you what the situations are, circle and fly around the airport a little. Fly around the airport, look at that runway. Are there tracks on it from people in a snowmobile? Are there real tracks on it from people landing on an airplane? But if it looks like it might be good to go, then you should be okay. Look for ice, snow, slush, water de-icing, and be aware that all those may be things you're dealing with as you land. Let the aircraft slow down before turning off the runway. Land, let it roll out, and don't try to stop soon, because if you're on ice, you're just going to start sliding around and you may end up going off the runway. Taxi at a reduced speed once you get off the runway so you don't slide off the taxiway. You want to refuel the aircraft as soon as possible to combat that potential to have water vapor later or the next day when you start the engine. Install engine inlet and pitot covers as soon as you are done with the airplane. Install control locks if there's a lot of wind so you don't damage the flight controls. And at engine shutdown, turn the fuel off and run the carburetor dry. So there's no possibility of a problem with icing in the fuel. Now let's talk specifically about icing itself. Icing is difficult to forecast. The physics of it are complex. And like I said, most general aviation aircraft don't have anti-icing, don't have de-icing. The only thing it has is you and your eyes and your ability to look at the control surfaces and the wings and see what's happening. At an air temperature of 0 degrees centigrade or 32 F, with the exception of what I said before, and the airframe temperature below 0, that whole airplane itself serves as the condensation nuclei for something to condense or sublime on it to form ice. And don't forget, freezing releases heat, just like condensation releases heat that we talked about when we did the environmental lapse rate. So I could have ice forming on the leading edge of the wing and going through that state of becoming ice as it gives off latent heat. It won't freeze immediately on impact depending on the droplet size. We're going to talk about that in a minute. And it will tend to run back a little as it freezes. The most common clouds we're going to see that from are nimbostratus clouds, cumulus clouds, and cumulonimbus clouds. The kind of ice that is clear ice, and it'll be nice and shiny and smooth, and once again, you can't get rid of it unless you have an anti-ice or de-ice system, unless you find warm air. You call air traffic control, and ask them if there's an altitude you can go to where you might be able to get it off. The other kind of icing is rime ice. With rime ice, when the water droplets hit the leading edge of the wing, they freeze on contact. There's no runoff because it's happening so fast, and you can get ice on the leading edge that looks like the ice in your freezer. I'll come back to this in a minute. Gotta wait here. Talked about the far. Here we go. Here's icing on the leading edge of a wing. On the right-hand side is the clear ice, and on the left-hand side is the rime ice. The rime looks just like what you might see in your freezer. No problem if you've got anti-icing or de-icing, but in an aircraft, if you have that in there, you've got to make an instant change. You've either got to get that plane on the ground or see if air traffic control can find you some warmer weather. I'm going to go back now to one other slide, to this slide, and I just want to put on here what I put. From Boeing aircraft, we have what's called the clean airplane concept. If it's not aerodynamically clean, we're going to get the following result. We're going to have a reduced lift from the wing and the control surfaces. We're going to have increased drag. We're going to have an increased stall speed. We're going to have potentially severe roll problems and possible abnormal pitch problems. So the aircraft needs to be clean. No ice, no frost, no snow. Okay, now in my next PowerPoint here, just a sec. 1 minute? No, sorry. Okay, now, ice can form on an aircraft leading surfaces at altitudes where freezing starts and above, and like I said below, water droplets in the air can be supercooled. Let's talk about supercooled water. Negative 40 degrees centigrade is the exact same temperature of negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. An amazing phenomena can occur if the water is very pure. It won't freeze at minus 40 degrees. You can prove this to yourself if you live in a winter environment. Get a couple bottles of bottled water and put it somewhere in your car and leave it overnight. And in the morning, have a thermometer in the car. In the morning, look at the thermometer and see what the temperature is. Let's say it's 20 degrees below zero if you're in Michigan or Wisconsin or Minnesota. And look at the bottles, and there will probably be one of those bottles of water that didn't freeze. because there's no condensation nuclei in the water for it to take place. But if you pick up the bottle of water, if you pick up that bottle of water and just shake it, it will instantly freeze because the inside of the bottle will become the condensation nuclei, just like the whole outside of the aircraft can be condensation nuclei for freezing. Well, if that water is at minus 40 degrees, it's ready to freeze. It just needs something to freeze on. And that freeze on is going to be your aircraft if it's cold enough. And as we depicted here, water droplets in the air can be supercooled to a below freezing temperature without actually turning into ice unless they're disturbed in some manner. However, the aircraft surface disturbs these droplets. They immediately turn to ice on the aircraft surfaces. And here we have a review of the clear icing. Large droplets in culiform freeze. Rime icing, where we have small supercooled droplets in stratiform clouds. And then we have mixed icing, where we actually get a combination of both. In aircraft that are equipped with anti-icing or de-icing, there's a way to handle this, but on a general aviation plane, there isn't, so you've got to get into warmer air or get on the ground. This is an ideal cloud phase. You can see where at the high altitude, there's no icing threat because there's no water vapor. The lower we go, we have potential for some icing. Then we get down near 0 degrees centigrade, where if there's moisture in the air, we're set for a significant icing threat. And of course, liquid water cloud, no icing threat if we're once again above freezing. So once again, file a flight plan. If you run into trouble, you'll be found. Have an ELT, help rescue teams find you quickly. Make sure you have some warm clothes and a survival kit. Sounds obvious, but if you've been flying all year long and all of a sudden it's the winter, you may not be thinking that. Don't forget pre-flight planning, get a weather briefing, look at the National Weather Service aircraft weather website for the section on icing. Do a walk around, do the fuel check, do a sufficient engine warm up, do your checklist. Once again, carb heat, signs of carburetor icing, loss of RPM, drop in manifold pressure, rough running, and your response to any of that is to immediately apply carb heat. That was pretty quick. There's a lot more to this that we might go into the next time, might actually go into the physics of what's behind all this. The closest we got today was talking about supercooled water. Thank you for joining us at Plane Time with the Florida Aviation Network. I'm Dr. Bartuska.